Let me turn it up.
Is it functioning?
Try again?
No, you don't hear anything.
There, now it's good. Now it's
You
good.
hear it?
Yeah.
I have to speak quite. I can see. Yeah, it catches it. I can hear. It has to be quite loud. Okay.
I'm
Okay.
coming to that part where I introduce you. All right. So, have you seen the
No, I have not seen the picture. No, I have not seen
The
it.
flyer?
Yeah, the flyer.
Oh, you have to
I
show
don't
me.
know.
Really cool flyer.
Somebody has it on there. I could probably pull it up on my phone.
Oh, you haven't got a flyer. I can give you some flyers of mine, but not the flyer about this meeting.
Thank you all for coming. Dr. Ursula King is truly a planetary scholar.
Oh, God.
She received her licentiate in sacred theology from Paris, her master's degree from Delhi in India, and her PhD in London. Planetary. She has held visiting chairs at universities in Europe and the United States, and has received honorary doctorates from both of these continents. I mean, just to get one would be great. She is, at the present time, Professor Emerita at the University of Bristol and Senior Research Fellow at the Advanced Institute, which is also at the University of Bristol. She lectures all over the world, and her publications are now well over 20 books. I counted 26.
Oh,
Is it 30?
I have no idea.
They're just so impressive. I want to give you a few of the titles to give you a sense of her scholarship. Teilhard de Chardin in Eastern Religions, Spirituality and Mysticism in an Evolutionary World, Women and Spirituality, Voices of Protest and Promise, The Search for Spirituality, Our Global Quest for a Spiritual Life. This afternoon she'll be presenting ideas on what could be the most important question in a philosophical or religious sense that we could ask today. Is the evolutionary process spiritual? Does it have a spiritual dimension? The title of her presentation, as I hope you know, is Cosmic, Human, and Divine, a dialogue between Teilhard de Chardin and Raimon Panikkar. It's just a thrill to have someone of your stature here, Ursula, and I just hope you know how much we appreciate it. Please join with me in expressing some appreciation that Dr. King came all the way from England to be here.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, for organizing this, and for all of you who are here and have helped for this to come together. It's really a delight to be back. I think I lectured here in December 2012, that was that. I'm really very delighted to be with you. I was asked to give some lectures on Teilhard de Chardin at Berkeley at the Jesuit School of Theology and at Santa Clara and in the Catholic community at Stanford. And I also talked at a class for students, for young students on religion and science. And this is obviously an extraordinarily important topic. And Teilhard is right in the middle of it, even though he died in 1955. So it's a long time ago. Now, what I'm presenting is really, well, I have worked on Teilhard for 50 years, which is a long time. I'll tell you about this a little bit in a minute. But I've also known Raimon Panikkar. I knew him for almost 50 years. I met him when I first went to Delhi in 1965. And I've been in touch with him ever since. And I went to his 90th birthday conference, which took place in Venice in 2010. And he sent me, I've got various papers and things he sent me. And this is a card, you can look at this, which he sent me in 1994 when he went on a 25-day pilgrimage to the great sacred mountain of Teilhard in Tibet, which is an absolutely transformative experience. And I think this must have been a little bit of a, how should I say, a small-scale production team effort or something, because he obviously, someone bought this. This is the great sacred peak of Mount Kailash, and this is a very famous sacred lake which goes with it, and it's supposed to be the peak of the world and the peak of enlightenment and so on. And he wrote here, this is written Tibet, 25th of September 1994. In that ultimate pilgrimage to Mount Kailash, one remembers friends and old times in this silent, empty, almost infinite space. Raimon Panikkar. So you can have that. I want it back, obviously. So I knew him till he died. He was born in 1918 and died in 2010. So he's almost, well, he's not 50 years after, but he's quite a different period from a different age, if you like. Teilhard de Chardin was born in France in Louvain in 1881 to 1955, right? And because I know both these great scholars and mystics and seers and whatever you want to call them, I sometimes, we compare ideas, or people have asked me to compare their ideas, and I've actually been invited to go and speak about this at a conference in Milan in connection with the Expo. The Expo is on the fullness of life, and where do we get our energy for feeding life, and how do you feed the planet? It's about ecology, really, and I'm very much looking forward to this. And the people who work on Teilhard de Chardin, the Italian Teilhard Association, decided this would be a wonderful time to have a conference on Teilhard. And the Panikkar people also thought this would be a good idea. So they have organized a conference on the tree of life on Panikkar and Teilhard. So they have asked me to speak on a new, spiritual paradigm for the world, if that's what they think it is, comparing these two men. But for me, this is really, you can't actually come to any definite conclusions. It's something that's a working process for me, but it's also thinking, and it's a process that is going on, because they have left us a tremendous legacy of writings, of commentaries, of all sorts of things. And there is, to some extent, quite a surprising affinity between these two thinkers, even though they are, they're quite a bit. Raimon Panikkar published his first book by which he became known, namely The Unknown Christ of Hinduism. He published that in 1964, when Teilhard had already been dead by 9 years. So I don't think the two ever met. I've never asked Panikkar, but I don't think they ever met. But they knew, Panikkar certainly knew of Teilhard's work. I don't think he would admit to having been influenced by him. But that's something which is very difficult to decide and to detect, because some people think that he is influenced by it. Now, Teilhard's works also didn't appear till after 1955. See, the phenomenon of man, now translated or retranslated more accurately as the human phenomenon, that didn't come out till 1955, right? And then his works, his essays, his ideas were published between 1955 and 1978. So there's a parallelism there, if you like, even though he lived much earlier, Teilhard lived much earlier. So I want to tell you that I'm still working on this, and I'm trying to wrestle with this. Now, the cosmic, human, and divine is actually something that Teilhard writes explicitly about, and that I have much more knowledge and experience about, because I've been working on this for many years. Whereas I know I've read quite a few of Panikkar's books. I've even had them have had to read his manuscripts for publishers and endorsements for the last 20 years. So I know some of his stuff. I was even asked, this is not a confidential breaking of confidentiality, when Panikkar was up for full professorship, I was asked by Santa Barbara to provide a reference. To my surprise, to my surprise. Anyway, Panikkar is obviously a very important person. And he wrote, and this is an idea that really comes up in his work only in the 1970s. I think the foreword is 1972, and this was actually only published in 1993. And that is the cosmotheandric experience, emerging religious consciousness, which is a very interesting work. It's published by Orbis in 1993. And Orbis are now publishing all Panikkar's work, the Opera Omnia, which are coming out, I think 2 volumes or 3 volumes out, but this is not being republished yet. They're collecting them and they're publishing one after the other. So it's in a way, it's a very exciting kind of field to study. And if you're interested in evolution and in the cosmos and in the new story and the universe story and the journey of the universe, it fits in beautifully, particularly with Teilhard's work. I think probably more so than with Panikkar's work. But I will only point this out whilst we go along. So just to say a little bit more about Teilhard, who I never met personally, obviously, but I was a student of theology in Paris, theology and philosophy. I used to go to the Sorbonne and the Institut Catholique in Paris from 1960 to 1963. And I did not know a single work of Panikkar's. Hi, come in. Welcome, find a chair. And in 1962, the Vatican edited a so-called monitum, that is a warning that Teilhard de Chardin's ideas must not be studied in Catholic seminaries. They're obviously very dangerous. So they should not be studied. And that was the first time when I heard this name. Now we were a very big class of students. We were about 200 students, of whom I was the only woman. There were only men. And I did my theology and philosophy there and had a very interesting time. And our theology professor in dogmatic theology was a very vibrant, dynamic Belgian Jesuit who was actually the world authority on Plotinus. He is the definite, he and a Swiss scholar called Schwitzer, my professor was called Paul Henry. They are the definite editors of the texts of the Enneads, of Plotinus's text in Greek. So he was a great scholar in Greek philosophy, and he used to come to the States. When I was studying in Paris, which was between 1960 and 63, he loved coming to the States. Paul Henry used to lecture 6 months in Paris, and then he would be 6 months in La Jolla at San Diego in California. And I've actually now met the people where he used to stay and all that. He died quite some years ago. But Paul Henry, who was really a bit of a rebel, he said he had known Teilhard, and he had tried in the last few years of Teilhard's life, in the early 1950s, to gather together some essays which had already been published, unlike all the other things which had not been published. And he got a Swiss publisher, and everything was fine. He was going to publish this book on behalf of Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard was delighted, absolutely delighted. And then the church would not give permission. The church authorities refused to implement it, so the whole thing fell through. So Perrowy was really incensed, and he said, right, we can't teach, I'm just making it up because of course he never told me this as a student, but we can't have his ideas in a Catholic seminary. Right, we don't teach the students, but I'm going to give a public series of lectures for the public in Paris, in the seminary. So we had big sort of amphitheater, with all these steps going on. And it was overcrowded. It was just a sensation. Everybody sitting anywhere on the floor and on the steps and everything. Everybody wanted to hear about this, you see. So we had these lectures, and it was just, mind-boggling, absolutely mind-boggling. And what was even more mind-boggling for me was that Perrowy, who I knew very well, he lent me overnight one of these secretly published documents, because Teilhard's writings, which were not published, were actually secretly cyclostyled, stenciled and distributed by the hundreds and sometimes by the thousands, you see. It was like a sort of Soviet subterranean literature, which he used to call mes clandestins, my secret little writings, right? So there were actually quite a few people. He had a following in Paris and in the States and in England, and people who liked to read about his ideas. And he had produced this essay, which is about 90 pages long. In the year 1950, he produced an essay which is called The Heart of Matter. So it's about matter, but at the heart of matter, there is the heart of the world, the heart of a God, right? And this essay is a spiritual autobiography, you might call it, it describes in very beautiful and lyrical language his spiritual and scientific development also, how he became a scientist, how he discovered evolution, how evolution absolutely revolutionized his thinking, his attitude, his prayer life. His whole life was transformed. So I've written a long article about this in the Eastrop Journal, and it's called it A Vision Transformed, because it had a terrific impact, which starts in 1911 and goes right through his life until he dies in 1955. Right? So it's very, very powerful. And he describes his development, and you get really, for me, in my, from a hermeneutical point of view of interpreting Teilhard, this is the key essay where you have to start, long before the phenomenon of man, the human phenomenon. This is the essay which gives you an insight into his psychological, intellectual, and spiritual development, which really unlocks the different vignettes and perspectives that you have in all these disconnected essays that came out through a lifetime, over 40 years. You see, you really get this. And I was very fortunate that is the first thing that I read ever. And it wasn't published, this was in 1962. It wasn't publicly available until 1978. It's one of the last things they ever published, this committee that came together because he knew, and he was told by one Jesuit, who was a professor of theology, you better get your writings published if you want to get anything published, but the Jesuits won't do it. Give them to a person outside the Jesuit society. So before he marched off to do some of his last excavations and scientific consultations in South Africa in 1951, he met a woman who had been a follower of his and had been reading his writings in these cyclostyle forms for 20 years or so. And he made out a testament, his will, to say that all the writings go to her. So neither the family of Teilhard nor the Jesuits could actually stop them. So this woman was called Mademoiselle Mortier. I mean, they're all long dead. But I knew all these people. She got a committee together under the patronage of the Belgian Queen, Marie-José, don't ask me why, but and she got an international group, largely Belgian and French scientists together to form a committee, and that was going to decide how they would publish these works, right? And that's what happened. And the first thing they published in 1955, right when he died on the 10th of April, it's just his 60th anniversary of his death, they produced the human phenomenon, because that had been lying there for 4 or 5, well, over 10 years to be published, and he couldn't get it published. And it was, he wasn't exactly heartbroken, but it was such a sense of frustration and disappointment to him. That was the only book we finished, and The Divine Milieu, which had been published, which had been finished in 1927. So, you can see suddenly these ideas come out in the open, and it was an absolute publishing sensation. He was a bestseller #1. He was more read than Simone de Beauvoir or Sartre. And I've got a French literary journal to tell you all this at the time. This was a sensation because this came completely unexpected into the open. You see, what was this man thinking? A Catholic and Jesuit about evolution. I mean, everything was just so surreal almost. And I remember Pierre Henry coming back from Belgium. He said, can you imagine? He said, I find the customs officer at the border reading The Phenomenon of Man. It was this kind of, everybody wanted to know what this was. It was talked about everywhere. That's long ago. So you get a bit of a feeling for this, you see? And I want to just have a time to read this out. Now let me see where we put it on this one. Yeah, let's have it. So I begin this talk with the assumption that both Teilhard and Raimon Panikkar look at the world from a similar perspective when they speak about threefold dimension of the cosmic, human, divine. They both use this. But Panikkar, from 1970 onwards, uses this Greek term, or he creates a term, cosmotheandrism. Now, Teilhard also speaks much earlier about theandrism, which is really a combination of the Greek theos, God, and amneia, the human. So this, the divine and the human, is what's traditionally studied in theology. The cosmos is an added on since modern evolutionary consciousness developed, you see. So Teilhard says theandrism, and then Panikkar makes this cosmotheandrism, which is a word that Teilhard does not use, but he speaks about cosmos, human, the cosmic, the human, and the divine. So what is the meaning of all this? How significant is this vision within an evolutionary world? Both thinkers are well aware of the epic of evolution, or the journey of the universe, as you might say now, and the impact of evolutionary becoming on all realms of human experience. Both were deeply influenced by the developments of modern science and the emergence of a new Earth consciousness. But they perceived what Teilhard called the accelerating process of planetization, that the world is becoming one, becoming global. It's a perception of a planet. What does this mean for humanity's further self-evolution and the understanding of spirit? Will the new Earth consciousness lead to a new Earth community? This is actually, this very sentence was asked by Indira Gandhi at the UN meeting in 1979. You know, we have a new Earth consciousness. Will this lead to a new Earth community? You know, quite, I mean, people had really searching questions. Will it lead to new spiritual paradigms? In other words, will humans be able to discover the great wisdom of the Earth? Can they detect a spiritual significance and purpose in the evolutionary process? So these are the questions that they try to wrestle with. Now, Panikkar and Teilhard can be compared, and they have quite a few similarities, but they're also quite different. Panikkar, his first doctorate is in science, but it's in leather chemistry, you see. He worked on something quite practical because his family were the biggest owners of tannery factories working on leather. I mean, Spanish leather for leather handbags and shoes and you know, all these kind of things. So he was really destined to go. His father was actually a Hindu from India, and his mother was Spanish Catholic. But it's his family that has all this leather stuff. And his sister, I think, she eventually looked after this huge factory, whatever, because Panikkar says somewhere, I went from chemistry, he did leather chemistry in relation to leather tanning and so on. I went from chemistry into philosophy, and then from philosophy into theology. So he has a scientific and a philosophical and theological training. And Teilhard, of course, as a Jesuit, was being trained in theology, but at the same time he had this absolute desire to be a scientist. And he calls this his two vocations, which go back to his childhood, because he grew up in the volcanic Auvergne, where his father, I mean, they had a big country estate, and his father was a sort of, how should I say, a gentleman, not just a gentleman farmer, but he was also interested in historical documents, but he was interested in his environment, and he studied. They had 11 children at the time, and he took his children around, teaching them to find stones, bones, fossils, you know, to be very attentive to nature, to the trees, and so on. So from an early age onwards, he did collect specimens. But apart from collecting specimens, he obviously had also some very special gift. And we know much more about him because he tells us much more in this Heart of Matter essay, whereas Panikkar says very little about his development. That's quite mysterious, and there's quite a hidden dimension to find out who he really was, how he developed. You know, he doesn't spell it out, but Teilhard spells it out quite clearly. So he had what you might call a pantheistic inclination, which sounds strange for someone who's 5 or 6 years old. But he says that he was always looking for something greater, bigger, something that didn't rust, that was permanent, you know, and he was trying to find things, like, for example, he found a little piece of an iron, a piece in the farmyard or in the field where they had been plowing, from a plow, that's it was it, a piece from a plow, and he hides it, and he calls this later on, my iron God. He worshipped, this was something permanent, this was solid. And then when he discovered it was getting rusty, he got terribly upset and cried his head out, you know. And similarly, he describes when he was about 3 or 4, he had golden locks, and there's a beautiful little portrait of him with all these wonderful child locks. And then his mother cut some of these locks and threw them in the fire in the chimney, and they all burned up and disappeared. And he got terribly upset because it wasn't permanent. He was always looking for something permanent and solid. And he finds his permanence and solidity eventually in the rocks, but in the rocks where they're the fossils. So he has got this desire to really grasp something that stays with him, that is reliable and permanent. I mean, these are words that he describes his own childhood inclinations as. But then he was also very religious, because they're a very devout Catholic family, and his mother had a deep devotion to the Christian mystics, and she introduced him to the Christian mystics. He read the mystics very early on, and to these traditional Catholic devotions, to the Sacred Heart, and what else, to Our Lady. And he was very active at school. He was a good student. He went to a boarding school. And then by 17, he suddenly thinks he has got a vocation, wants to become a Jesuit, because he was in a Jesuit boarding school where all the boys of the family were sent. The girls were educated by governesses at home. And his father says, what? No, you're not going off into a monastery. You just study a bit more. And he made him take a degree in mathematics or something. You study. And he did his first degree, actually. I don't know how all this came about. He has a licence in literature. He used to read a lot of literature, contemporary literature. Anyway, he stayed with the Jesuits, and he became a Jesuit. He entered the Jesuit novitiate. But what happened is that at that time, in about 1899 or so, thereabout, 1901 it must have been, the French government was very anti-clerical, and the Jesuits were thrown out of France. So they suddenly, in the dark of night, had to leave one fine day, and they all finished up in England, right, to educate their novices in England. They first went to the island of Jersey, which also has a lot of fossils and which is surrounded by the sea. It's a channel island. And he spent from 1902 to 1905 there. And he just loved going fossil hunting in the cliffs on the seaside. And he did this with some friends, and he collected a lot of stuff. And he actually he collected enough material which contributed to a more adequate and bigger, more correct mapping of geology in Jersey. And this is testified by the Geological Society in Jersey, and they published a nice big stamp with Teilhard, and then there's a bulletin that describes all the things he's done about Jersey geology. But after 1905, these young Jesuits, they have to teach somewhere to get some experience, so they get sent out into Jesuit school. And he was sent, where was he sent? To Egypt, of all places, because the French, I've forgotten what the province, the Jesuit province in the Lyon province, was responsible for the Jesuit schools in the Middle East. So he was sent off to Cairo, and he taught in a Jesuit college. He taught boys, Egyptian boys, who were largely Muslims, from 1902 till 1905. And then when he could then he ran a little museum there, and he did the experiments. He taught physics and chemistry for 3 years. And when he could get time off, he was off fossil hunting in the desert. You know, he went to particular places where he could find fossils, and it was entrancing. He writes about Egypt ecstatically. This was the great open spaces. He always dreams about them. The desert, the sea, the sky, you know, it's just the immensities of the cosmos, of the earth as he experienced it, the beauty. And he really had, you know, he had, as someone, Jean Houston said, he had 200 senses at one, tasting, feeling, you know, sort of a reverberation in his whole being about nature. So he spent those 3 years there. Then he went back from 1905 to 1908 in Cairo, And then he goes to the theology studies which were taking place in Hastings, which is a town in on the south coast of England, which has very, very steep cliffs, clay molds, where you get a lot of fossils. So he collects fossils, more fossils and more fossils. And these can be seen in the Hastings Museum, as I've seen them. You know, he collected little ferns and all sorts of fossils, and he analyzed them, he described them in a little paper, he wrapped them up lovingly, he boxed them in an old cigar box, you know, and you can see all this in the Hastings Museum. So he spent his time doing theology officially and doing science on the side, right? And he felt really he wanted to study at a higher level. But he was very torn. At one stage he thought, you know, he's drawn to God, to a religious life, and he's drawn so much to the world and to evolution and all. I mean, evolution wasn't really figuring very greatly at that stage, but it's nature, science, and the fossils. And he goes to his novice master. He had a very wise novice master, discussing, should he give up one for the other? Should he leave the Jesuits, become a scientist? Should he be a scientist, or should he be a religious? Or can he be both? And the novice master said he should really combine the two gifts that he has, right? So he was encouraged to do both. So he finishes his theological studies, and in 1911 he was ordained priest. And in 1912 he's off to Paris doing higher scientific studies for doctorate. And he works with a very, very foremost paleontologist who was the European specialist on Neanderthal man, Marcel Bull, at the French Museum of Natural History, which had opened its great, you know, this was under the impact of evolutionary teaching, all this. Everything was just new and moving forward, and he met the latest sort of scientific theories and students, and he started his PhD, working on some fossils. That was 1912, and by 1914, of course, the First World War broke out, so these studies got interrupted. And he was called to war service at the end of 1914. He started in early 1915. And he could have been an officer working in a non-combatant capacity as a priest. He was not supposed to be a fighting soldier. But he refused to do this. He didn't want to do this. At his own wish, he remained an ordinary soldier who was then engaged to be a stretcher bearer, which was a very low position in the French army. And he was extraordinarily, he finished up in a North African regiment with Moroccans and Tunisians. And he met also a lot of people from other parts of the French Empire, from Vietnam, also from Djibouti, from Senegal, you know, from all the French parts of the empire then. And for the first time, he was out of his sheltered milieu, i.e. his nice Catholic family and the Jesuit order, where he had never really, you know, he'd never lived in a city. Well, he lived in Paris for 2 years, which was a revelation in itself. But now the war, he was thrown into what he calls the human milieu. See, the cosmos, he discovers that in Egypt and in Jersey and in Hastings. And then now suddenly he is thrown into multiplicity, diversity of ethnic types, and people who are believers and people who are atheists and people who are, you know, from all parts of French society. And he works as an orderly stretcher bearer. And when you think, you know, you look at all these documentary films of the First World War, it is absolutely extraordinary. He fought every battle that the French army fought on the Western Front, and it's been calculated he was in 67 major battles, and he got a lot of distinction. Where he was mentioned in a lot of army dispatches because he was in an assault regiment, which was one of the foremost assault regiments of the French army, and he was working really. He wasn't even. He could have been a chaplain, but he wasn't even a chaplain officially. But unofficially, he worked very much as a chaplain, because what he did, he not only worked as a stretcher bearer, you know, dealing with the dying and the dead and whatever was happening, bandaging people's wounds, getting them off to hospital, whatever. He was so busy that you can't believe, anybody could find time for writing in the trenches, because his whole life in the trenches. And extraordinarily, he started writing in 1916, after he'd been in the army for a year and a half. And between the lulls of battle, he finds time when they are quartered in a farmyard or wherever, and there's no fighting going on, and he writes his ideas down in a beautiful handwriting. I don't think I've brought anything. I usually carry something out to show you. And you just can't think, oh yes, how anyone could do this. And it is so extraordinary. And the first essay is actually called La Vie Cosmique, Cosmic Life. And it is about the experience of nature and the beauty of nature in the horrid context of the trenches. So I argue that he can only do this from memory, what he remembered, what he saw, what, he calls this the temptation of matter. He's so drawn to the haunting beauty of the world and the beauty of life and everything. It's absolutely lyrical what he writes, and you think what was actually happening, surrounded by all this fighting and how can anyone have these, the peace of mind and writing. Here, you have to look at this is his handwriting. And this is dated 17th of May 1916. This is a copy of the original. So, what is extraordinary, and I must absolutely highlight this, and really no work has been done on this, and I'm really very, very excited about it, that in all the battles of the Western Front, where millions of people died, he did not have as much as a single shell wound. He was never, ever harmed, in spite of being directly involved in the trench warfare. And the Muslim soldiers from North Africa used to call Monsieur Teilhard a Sidi Marabout. And a Sidi means a North African who settles in France, but who's really a North African. So they saw him as one of theirs. But Marabout is a Sufi term for a person who is shackled to God like a camel to a post. So you can't move, and is so protected by God, by God's barakah, by the grace, that nothing can ever harm this person. So that's how they saw it, So you must see there must have been really something very special about this man for having this kind of description. And it is his regiment, that requested after the war that he will be given a medal of being a chevalier, a knight of the Légion d'honneur of France, which is a very high distinction, because they felt he had shown such bravery and such faithfulness and such commitment that he should be distinguished like that. Right? That's when he's about 30 years old, So you have, it's an extraordinary story. It's a really extraordinary story. But I haven't said anything about his discovery of evolution. You see, in Hastings, and I've written a paper, a learned paper, you can read about this in the History of Journal, A Vision Transformed. In 1911, when he had already studied quite a bit of science, but he had a completely traditional Catholic static view, about man, the history of man. He wrote a long article for Catholic Dictionary, which is, it doesn't smell in any way of evolution. It's a completely static, the creation of the human couple, Adam and Eve, by God and all the rest of it. So no evolution there. But at the same time, he couldn't study science without coming across scientific theories about evolution, and there's other things. And then it clicks. In 1911, it clicks because he reads Bergson's Creative Evolution. And I haven't got the time. I could quote you many passages from this essay, The Heart of Matter, where he describes all this in great detail. How Creative Evolution by Bergson, which is a philosophical work, it really didn't make him an evolutionary, but it just provided the kind of trigger, if you like, because he said he was ready, that already had this fuel, these lights within himself about the nature of matter, the nature of energy, the nature of life, and he just needed this sparking effect to set him off on, to see the evolutionary becoming as a dynamic process, and we would say today perhaps, but suddenly everything in nature becomes alive, it explodes, and he uses all the time this image of fire. Everything is set alight, everything is on fire, everything is moving, and for him, he interprets that then in religious, spiritual, and mystical terms. He sees everywhere not just life, but he sees something of what he calls a Christic element, the divine at the heart of creation, the divine disclosing itself in blazing matter. I mean, it's wonderful, wonderful, very lyrical expressions, which are not always very well translated into English. So there's a great sense of poetry in his writings. He writes about 16 essays, and then when the armistice has already come into being in 1918, he still writes another 3 before they are discharged from the army. So he writes about 18 or 19 essays during this time. And it's all about his perception of nature, his understanding of what it means to be a priest, and how it connects what he studies in science and what he sees in nature with his Christian understanding of the presence of God. He speaks about the hands, the flesh of God. Everything is translated into very unusual, very untraditional terms, but it is triggered off by both his religious faith and by his scientific knowledge. And he felt all his life, but this comes very through in this war. The war essays were published only in 1965 in French and in 1968 in English. And they're called Writings in Time of War. And they're all really personal confessions is not the right word, but they are really an expression of mystical experience, really, and an interpretation of his attitude to life, the world, the cosmos, in religious terms. And he sees really how all this is building up to an immense kind of, you would say, the immense story. For him, it's a body. He sees something happening, and he wants to tell people about what he has experienced, what he felt, and what he's seen. So all his life, he says this at the end of his life, all his life he felt he had seen something new, something that was different from what other people saw, and he wanted to communicate this. And the reason why he writes his first essay and then writes so many afterwards, he says, I want to leave my intellectual testament, just in case I don't come back from these battles, right? I want to write this, I want to explain. And each time, and he writes an incredible story, which is a mystical story about a mystical experience, 10 days before the final devastating battle of Verdun, when the French recaptured the Verdun, the Douaumont Fort. And it is just so extraordinary, you just can't believe it. And he says at the very end, if I don't come back from those heights, from the fort up there that they're going to recapture, I want to be buried in the earth here and be part of the new foundation of the new Jerusalem. That's how he says it. And you think, my goodness, what did this man actually think? It's just so incredible. It is really so incredible. But you can see there is a personal engagement. And what he describes in this 1916 essay, the third one, it's only his third one, it's called Christ in Matter. And it is a story after R.H. Benson. R.H. Benson was the son of an Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury. And this man had become a Catholic and became a novelist and used to write religious and mystical stories. And Teilhard read some of this and was quite inspired by that. So he writes a story, 3 stories actually, short, very short stories, like sketches. And it is, it's the encounter with Christ within the blazing fire of evolution and of nature. But it happens like this. He doesn't write in the first person. He writes about a friend who's already dead, buried in the earth in front of Verdun. This friend had this experience, but it's really about Teilhard himself. I mean, everybody who knows says it's about Teilhard himself. And he goes into church to pray. And he prays in front of a very ordinary kind of Catholic picture of the heart of the Sacred Heart, the statue of Jesus with a heart, with a burning heart, with the flames all coming out and reaching the cosmos. And he prays, and suddenly he has this experience, he has this vision, this painting explodes. The frames, I don't know, some of you know that, the story? It just extends to the dimensions of the universe, and everything he describes, everything becomes alive, everything runs, fire runs through everything, life, energy, and it's this huge cosmic body. I mean, it's very, very powerful. And, this stays with him, it stays with him. He says he reinterprets everything from this kind of experience, and it was for him something that he wanted to preach, if you like. He wanted to tell people. He said, we are an atom in the cosmic body of Christ. We are all an atom in it. We are all, what he sees is the interconnection of humanity. Now everybody belongs, how we are much greater all together than we are individually and so on. So there is such an extraordinary depths in there that really, I could give you so many different quotations. In the heart of matter, he describes the divine Daphne, the shining through, the luminous transparency of divine presence, energy, and power in all living things. And that's where he talks about these three components as defining characteristics of this vision. And these are the cosmic, the human, and the Christic elements, which do provide a parallel with Panikkar's cosmotheatric experience. But Panikkar arrives at this in quite a different way. Now let me think how much time I've got. Gosh, I've been talking for a long time. I should say more about Panikkar, I really care. But I wanted to just give you this, this feeling for something very vital and alive in Teilhard's life, and he felt this had become his gospel, if you like, his vision, his belief, and he couldn't really understand anything anymore in any traditional sense. So he starts writing in a very unusual way, and his friends get quite upset, or some of people couldn't understand, because they feel he's quite pantheistic. I mean, when he came out of the war, he went for a holiday back to the island of Jersey, and he writes an essay there which is very stirring. I don't think I've got it this mentioned. It's called The Spiritual Power of Matter, right? And it finishes with an absolutely ecstatic hymn to matter. And basically what it is about is to show that there is not matter and spirit as two separate things, but that matter itself gets more and more centrified, densified, I don't know how to describe it, but however more it gets concentrated, it becomes, it goes into something more spirit, into consciousness. And so it's a rise of consciousness in the human phylum in evolutionary terms over millions of years. And he sees this as one reality that belongs together, so that there is no separate matter that is just dead. Everything moves on towards life, and he sees really a direction to evolution, which of course not all scientists would agree with, but he feels there is a direction, and there is somehow for him, also from the perspective of faith, there is a goal, there is a purpose. Now, where have I got this picture? I can pass this round also. This is a kind of diagram that someone has done in France about Teilhard from the alpha, from the beginning to the omega. Everything rises, everything gets complexified, but also centered, and everything moves. You have, I don't think I've got this with me, there's a diagram I have which a Japanese student did, which is absolutely wonderful. So, he sees really that Brian would be much better at talking about this than I'm not just that. The divergence of evolution, the development of branches into all sorts of directions, eventually moves into some convergence. And convergence, a centering, a bundling, and the transformation, the movement into life, into ever greater centering. So you have these diagrams. he used to draw a lot of drawings in his diaries, you know, and you see this rise and he calls this movement upwards. He has the diagram of a cone. You get a circle, but not a circle that ends in itself, but that rises and rises and rises, and the circumference gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller till it's in a peak, you know, and that's for him the omega. I mean, that's the way he sees it. And he feels that that is what he calls complexity consciousness. You see, we do not only have the infinite, the infinitely small and the infinitely large. We now have the infinitely complex, and then it gets so complexified that, you know, it gets ultimately for him spiritualized. I mean, you have this in the hymn to Mitta. It's very, very powerful, and he sticks by it. He adds it to his later essays. Now, would you like to pass this on? Yeah. Now, what else should I say about this? You see, there's so much that it has an impact on human action, it has an impact on the zest for life, and he sees the human being not as a static center, but the axis and leading shoot of evolution. And that goes together with his idea of the noosphere, which also comes out of the trenches, because this is quite mystical and quite extraordinary. When he was on night watch in the trenches, you know, and there was a full moon in the sky, he would see suddenly, I mean, he would have an inner vision and see as if the earth was surrounded by a layer of blueness, you know, as seen from the moon. And he describes a picture that is almost like this famous picture of planet Earth from the astronauts landed on the moon. The picture called Earthrise, the globe, the planet in space, right? And he describes this like in a dream. And he says, well, you know, there is something rising around the Earth, and he calls it, you know, a layer, which he later on describes as the human layer, the planetary layer, that envelops the entire globe all around it, and it's a specifically human layer, and he doesn't know how to actually describe what to call it. And he calls it, he calls it first the monad. Are we alone in space? Where are we? Where we go? And then he tried anthroposphere, you know, like lithosphere and atmosphere. He speaks about the anthroposphere. Now, this doesn't sound so good either. So when he comes out of the First World War and has his seminars with his philosopher friend who was very interested in evolution, Edouard Lebrun, from the, can you hear, is this working? You can hear me at the back? Okay. He was he was a fellow of the Académie Française, the most distinguished intellectual company you can keep in France. And Teilhard and Leroy, they used to meet in private seminars discussing what they were thinking, what were their latest ideas. And they worked through this and through this and through this. And eventually they came up with this idea of the noosphere, which is sometimes translated as the planetary mind. It's not an entirely satisfactory translation. But the idea is it's a specific human sphere where consciousness has come into full flowering. And the nous is not the mind in terms of the brain. It's not our rational, logical, deductive reasoning, but it is the nous. You know, there's the ratio, as the Latins used to call it, our mind. But the nous is a Greek word for the inner vision. You know, it includes our brain, our mind, but it is an inner vision which has an integrating capacity, so that you not just know facts and little things here and there, but you can see something as a whole, right? And so this noosphere is a sphere of human thinking, interthinking, I call it interaction, connection, and working together, collaborating, communicating, and loving and transforming the world. And this goes together. Later he has developed an extraordinary teaching about the phenomenon of love. And I mean, that would require a whole seminar itself. And this is a very powerful, I've also written an article in Saigon about this, the phenomenon of love. And he thinks, you see, he talks about love. Everything for him is at a threshold. We are just, we are in a state of a change of state, a change of phase. We are having to start a new era. We're having to start. It's not just in terms of time, but in terms of consciousness. We are what's the word? Battling. No, battling is not a good word. We are striving. We are groping. We are seeking a new form of consciousness. And so he speaks. You see, he has as a methodology a very specific kind of phenomenology. So he speaks about the phenomenon as science, the factual phenomena, the descriptions that science has. I've got a little diagram here which comes from one of my books. So you see, you have this book, Theilhard's main book, Le Phénomène Humain, the human phenomenon. What is specific about the human phenomenon? Now, he doesn't only talk about the phenomenon of man, the human phenomenon, but he speaks, you get it, this is diagrams in concentric crisis. The phenomenon, the human phenomenon, that's part of the evolutionary wave of becoming. But for him, there are lots of other phenomena which are included in this phenomenon. They're not subordinate, but they are more centric, if you like. The phenomenon of man is characterized by the phenomenon of religion, whatever you understand by religion. But that's not enough. The phenomenon of religion is centered in the phenomenon of spirituality. That's not enough either. Phenomenon of spirituality is centered in the phenomenon of mysticism. That's not enough either. Because the phenomenon of mysticism is centered in the phenomenon of love. Now this is something, Teilhard does talk about all this in the terms I've used, but he does not develop this in the systematic way that I'm presenting it here. But this is very, very important because he says love. He says our love is too small. We have not understood the power of love, which is, it is a cosmic force of attraction, of transformation, of building up things together. So he uses it in a very extended meaning. But he says it's a wild force in the cosmos. It is there everywhere. We can't control it. It is not static. It is the spiritual energy, the blood of evolution. That is love. It's the blood of evolution. So he has a very spiritual way of looking at that. But then he says, our loves are so small. We are not thinking big enough. We have restricted love to our family and friends and to the tribe and maybe to the nation. But the love has to belong to the entire world, to all human people, to the cosmos, to the universe, And then he says, well, is it psychologically possible to love more than, a few people? We can't love a multitude, we can't love millions. But he understands it in a symbolic, metaphorical way. He says we can have this power, and we can develop it to a higher degree. And he speaks about the need for a greater force or power of what he calls amorization. He has this tendency of always developing new vocabulary, which is not always so easy. Amorization. Now, Sorokin, I don't know, are you familiar with Sorokin? Have you ever heard the name? The American-Russian sociologist who founded the sociology department at Harvard in the 1930s after being thrown out of the Soviet Union. Well, that's an old story in itself. He was the first trained Russian sociologist, and he already went to prison under the Tsars, and then the communists wanted to behead him, and he was saved at Lenin's generosity and was thrown out of the country, went to the Czechoslovakia at the time, and then finished up in Harvard and founded the sociology department. And he worked there for 30 or 40 years, but in the 50s he got really rather marginalized because Talcott Parson wanted to develop his theory of action, and he got the upper hand. So Sorokin had to do something else, and he had a great philanthropist friend to give him money to set up an institute for studying, I think it was either called the Institute for Altruism, or it was called something like the Contemporary Institute Study of Unlimited Love. It's the idea of how can we increase the power of love. And he wrote a book in 1954, which is really very good and extremely provocative. and it's called The Ways and Power of Love. And he has an extraordinary range of things he looks at. And what he's interested in is how historically small groups, whether Hindu yogis in India or whether the Shakers in the United States or the Quakers in Europe, have had small experimental communities where they have shared life and resources and built up communities that were inspired and carried by the powers of love in a very transformative way, which has not been extended to the whole of society. But he really argues this must be extended around the globe, and if we can do this, we have to really study and assemble and collect the powers of love, because these are energy resources which we have totally ignored or paid very little attention to. So he thinks very similar. He uses almost the same vocabulary as Teilhard, but these two men never met, they never knew of each other's existence. Sorokin lived about, I can't remember exactly when he died, either in the 70s or 80s. He lived longer than Teilhard. But when you read what they wrote, you think, this sounds very familiar. How did he get this into his head or this one? It's extraordinary. And it's about the phenomenon of love as a force of transformation in human society and in human individuals and groups. So it's very, very powerful. So that's about the phenomenon of love. Now let me think whether I need to say anything else. Maybe you have some questions, but I should not come to Panikkar. I've got so many notes on Panikkar. Oh my goodness. Right. Any questions to what I've said? Or shall we, what do you think? What is best?
I think you should dive into Panikkar.
Yeah, a little bit.
Then we can work. Because if we start asking questions on Taylor, poor Raymond will never get that word in.
No, that's true. That's true. Now let me have a look where I've got my Panikkar things. Just a minute. Panikkar's coming. Now, if you're really interested in studying Panikkar, there is an amazing book written by a Finnish theologian. This is largely concentrating on the role of religion, but it's called An Emerging Cosmotheandric Religion, ? Raimon Panikkar's Pluralistic Theology of Religions. But it's a man called Komolainen who has written a very long book review on this. And it is, well, I will talk about some of these things. It's quite extraordinary what this man has written about it. Quite extraordinary. Now let's come to Panikkar. Now Panikkar, he was also a man who bridged many different worlds, drawing on his Indian background and his Spanish background. His education in different countries, because he did his PhDs, he did a PhD, I forgot all this, his education in Italy. First he had a doctorate, well, he has a doctorate of philosophy from the University of Madrid. Oh, this is before. Doctorate in chemistry, I think this is from England, something 1958, and a doctorate in theology from Rome in 1961. It's pretty impressive. And he, let me just think. He first attracted considerable attention through his book, which I've already mentioned, The Unknown Christ of Hinduism, in 1964, which he edited in a more critical revisionist way in a second edition in 1981. I met Panikkar actually shortly after that, reading this book. This was in 1965, and I was very much enthused by this book. And because I was going to India and living in India for 5 years, which I didn't know at the time, but I wanted to meet this man, and I wrote the publisher, and they were not very willing to give any details about this man, whose name I had never heard before. But then when I went to India with my husband and family, there was the All India Congress of Philosophy, which was quite a big event in Delhi. And who was speaking at this congress but Dr. Panikkar, Raimon Panikkar. That's how I first met him, and I have been in touch with him ever since when he was alive. And it was at that time, in 1965 that he then came to the States. He had lived in Benares for some time. After living in Spain, he lived in Benares. And he then came to the States, and he first was for a year at the Harvard Divinity School, and then I think in 1966 or thereabout, roughly, he became a lecturer first and then eventually professor at Santa Barbara University. And he was in the USA from 1966 to 1987, so that's a pretty long time, 21 years, lecturing and having students and traveling the world and so on and so forth. So he was very, very active. And what is very complex with Panikkar, because he's a man of many languages, that includes the ancient languages of Sanskrit and Latin and Hebrew and Greek, but also Spanish, Italian, English, German, French. He has the habit, which can be quite annoying actually, he has the habit of philosophizing and talking in all these languages at once. He uses one Greek term and then a Hindu, Sanskrit term and then a Latin term, and then it is too much. It's too much. If you want, and I'm not the only one to say this, if you want to really read a critical, well, it's interesting. Scott Easton, who has edited this, he has written a very nice foreword to this book, and he talks about the difficulty of really interpreting Panikkar because of, there are very, very few readers who can actually match Panikkar's knowledge of words, so you're never quite sure what he's actually trying to say. But he always, if you can follow his argument, there are always subtle differences, and he knows how to, he was an extraordinary, I don't know, did you ever hear him talk? I mean, he was a very, he was a really jumpy Spaniard, and he would talk, and he'd come up with all these ideas, and you would get either mesmerized or you'd be completely puzzled and thunderstruck and didn't know what it was all about. So it could either be very simple, I mean, he had his phases, he could be very simple and he could be very nice or very descriptive, and then suddenly would be out or off on a flight and you didn't know where he was going. So it's very difficult. But I've got some lovely, in the later years of his life, and he mellowed. I mean, he died at the age of 92. I knew him, I saw a lot of him in the later years, 80 to 90. He was just a beauty. I mean, he looked like a transparent, beautiful, radiant, saintly figure, absolutely glorious, beautiful, really beautiful, real kind of sage and figure of wisdom, sitting under the tree, meditating. I mean, fantastic, really fantastic. So, he's an extraordinary human being. And his works cover such a wide-ranging perspective, so many perspectives in theology, in philosophy, in the comparative study of religion, that no single author can possibly do justice to them. Who could capture all the facets of the daring vision of this foremost intercultural and interreligious thinker who wrote in several European languages for over 50 years? It's very difficult to study. Some good studies on particular aspects of his thought exist, but they are far too numerous for me to mention them now. I think I've mentioned some of his major books, just a minute. I think that's coming in a minute. I draw here on the multifaceted discussion that you can find in one volume, edited actually by someone in the States he's not at Santa Clara, I can't remember where he is, Joseph Prabhu, do you know him? Yeah. He has edited a book which is quite interesting, The Intercultural Challenge of Raimon Panikkar. That's August Books, 1996. For those who are interested in theology of religions or interreligious dialogue, one of the most comprehensive studies is this Finnish one, which I mentioned earlier, by Komulainen, who looks at an emerging cosmotheandric religion, ? But he discusses also many other topics of Panikkar's large work within the context of the dialogue of cultures and civilizations and the challenges of pluralism, which was a particular theme of Panikkar's. The publication of Panikkar's works is now in production, but this will take a long time because it's been calculated that there will be 30 volumes. And it started in Italy, and August Books is the English edition, and I think they've done 3 volumes so far. So, I mean, you can see this can go on for a long time. For further information, if you want to see more on Panikkar, look at the website www.raimonpanikkar.org, because there is a whole industry going on. And some of his well-known books include, and I mentioned some titles here, and they are good. I have no doubt about this. They are very stimulating. One is called The Silence of God, The Answer of the Buddha. Another one, Worship and Secular Man. Another one, The Vedic Experience, an anthology of the Vedas for modern man and contemporary celebration. I don't give you all the years. The Intra-Religious Dialogue is another one. Myth, Faith and Hermeneutics is another one. The Cosmotheandric Experience. I can pass this around, but it's very heavily annotated by my reading. I mean, I'm working on this volume, so but you get an idea. You can pass it around if you like. I want to see. I didn't bring any of the other books, they're too heavy. A Dwelling Place for Wisdom. And most recently, his long-awaited Gifford lecture. He gave these Gifford lectures over 20 years ago, and he was never satisfied that you could publish them. He always wanted to refine his ideas further. And someone then took hold of these lectures and published them just before he died. They came out in 2010, and they're called The Rhythm of Being, published after 20 years after they had been delivered. Now, to grasp Panikkar's Cosmotheandrism in full would require an in-depth study of his book, this book, which I'm wrestling with, but it is not a simple book, I can tell you that. It's quite complicated. So I want to just give you a brief summary, and I will give you some quotations. Panikkar's interweaving of cosmic, divine, and human, like Teilhard did it. I could say a lot more about Teilhard, but I won't do this now. But Panikkar is even more complex because it is rooted in the tradition of wisdom theology. And Panikkar is not primarily interested in disseminating his ideas, and he doesn't write for that. But he says that writing was for him a form of meditation. So it's quite wrapped around himself. And that's one of the problems of this writing, because you don't, unlike in Teilhard's work, you don't get any insight in Panikkar's own development. In fact, I have got almost the idea he's hiding it. And I tell you why. This has nothing to do with philosophy. In the early 1940s, 50s, when he was ordained a priest, he joined the Opus Dei. And I did not know this for most of my life. I learned this not recently, but only in the last 20 years, and I was very shocked, right? But he was recruited by the founder of Opus Dei to become an Opus Dei priest. I don't know exactly how many years he spent there, maybe 15 or 20. He used to work as an editor of a philosophical journal in Madrid in the 1950s. And he also recruited someone else who was a philosopher, Carmen Tapia, who became his PA and worked with him in Santa Barbara for over 20 years, and who's still in Santa Barbara, and she's 90 now. She's very active. And she was recruited and to be part of the pioneering early women's branch of the Opus Dei. And she was a very brave woman. She went off to found or to support a branch of Opus Dei in Venezuela, of all places, and she even took Venezuelan citizenship. But she realized, working among women in Venezuela, that all these ideas that had been thought out in Rome by Opus Dei founder didn't necessarily meet the needs of Venezuelan women, and she wanted to do something quite different. And she wouldn't get permission from these people in Rome, so there was a great kind of hiatus, a misunderstanding, whatever. And she eventually came to the insight that Opus Dei was not for her, and she left the Opus Dei. And that was a very major struggle because they imprisoned her in Rome in an apartment, and they wouldn't let her out. And then she eventually got out because she had a very powerful father who was a lawyer and very well connected. But then they wouldn't give her passport, and they wouldn't give her academic certificates. They had simply taken everything, and they want to keep everything. So she has written a big book about this, about getting over the doorstep, getting out of Opus Dei. It's a very moving book. She wrote it first in Spanish. It's translated into English and into German. I'm not sure whether it exists in French. But You see, when I met Panikkar and Carmen, who came to our house in Delhi in 1965, I can see it now, it was in October, no, it was in December 65 when this philosophical conference was being held. I did not know at that time, and I didn't know for 20 years, that that was the time at which they had just shortly before both left Theology, right? And that is never mentioned. Panikkar never will say a single word about this, you see. So I say there is a hidden dimension where you can't unpack what's actually going on. And his own life doesn't come into the story, right? So I feel there is a lack of dimensional witness. I mean, I say this very critically, because I have an ambiguous feeling about this myself. You know, why is it, you know, absolutely not? Curtain comes down, you see, and then he goes into these flights of ideas, and he was obviously superhuman kind of intelligence and had all these connections and insights. But somehow I feel there's something there which is hidden, you know, and I can't cope with this. I can't cope with this. So he writes then, he says it's meditation, you know, in his own words. Intellectual life turns for him into a spiritual existence, and as such it is a participation in the lives of the universe. That's a quotation from him. He even describes his writing as a religious undertaking, and his understanding of his intellectual vocation is ultimately mystic and is to be seen in intimate connection with his understanding of words and the Holy Scriptures. That's his own writing. I'm quoting from the book. Now, the novelty of Panikkar's cosmotheandric vision goes far beyond the traditional understanding of cosmos, theos, anthropos, cosmos, the world or the universe, God, and human being. It implies a significant mutation. It implies that a mutation has occurred in spirituality, which has revealed what Panikkar calls the holiness of the secular. He talks about sacred secularity, but I can never quite make out what he means by that. It's, you know, you get a certain fluidity of the concept, and you can't really pin him down, what is it exactly. Panikkar acknowledges that he stands at the confluence of the Hindu, Christian, Buddhist, and secular traditions. Well, what are you going to make of that, you know? And he was, I mean, I've seen him many times in lectures. He was a very playful thinker, and he delighted. And you would see his nice smile, you know, having this fun with words. You know, if you come follow me while you stay behind, kind of thing. So I'm a little bit critical. Even though I loved him, I found him really wonderful, inspiring. But you can see, everybody has their own limitations. Unlike most other pluralists, Panikkar does not found his theology on the Enlightenment tradition, but, as he says, on his idiosyncratic cosmotheandric vision, which draws from the primordial traditions that predate modern thinking. But he also takes into account the contemporary world and makes room for secularity. But in the judgment of this Finnish theologian, Panikkar's theology is at risk of resulting in existentialist anthropological reduction of religiosity. It seems that human experience is a sort of upper concept in his thinking. Now, this judgment or this assessment chimes in with what I'm trying to say. You know, you don't know really, is it a new vision, as Panikkar says it is, you know, cosmic theandric vision? But I have the impression when you press him, and I've got 2 or 3 pages of notes, and they drive me more and more to this idea that the more he develops his ideas, the more abstract they get, and I find they almost finish up in a more static position, you know, and in a kind of almost perennialist position, which I feel is not very helpful for an evolutionary study, even though he plays around with science and scientific ideas. So I have got problems about this man and his cosmotheandric vision, right? I tell you this very clearly. That is where I'm at the moment. I might change at some stage, I don't know. You see, he had his education entirely in the West. He went to India for the first time in 1954. He lived in a temple in Benares, in Varanasi, and many people visited him there, and he had some extraordinary insights, and he thought about these big things quite early on, but then he comes, when he has written his books, he comes more into the foreground, and he speaks, at conferences and in academic settings. But I know what is this man, a psychiatrist, a professor of psychiatry in Bristol, who I discovered to my great amazement as a young student, went to live with Panikkar in this temple for a year and did essays. He studied theology before he became a psychiatrist, and he's a very knowledgeable man. He's retired now. And he has lent me these essays that he wrote as a student in the early 1970s, based on his experience of living with Panikkar. I don't know when it was, in the 50s or whenever he was with Panikkar. And I was amazed. I hadn't expected that these essays already were touching on and expressing ideas of Panikkar, which I thought he had developed 20 or 30 years later. So, you don't know where you are. There is this fluidity, and there is this mass of material, and all these different books and works and so on. And there is it's very difficult to systematically organize the teaching or what he's saying, and you don't even know whether sometimes he's contradicting himself because he uses different styles of writing. So you get a fluidity, you sort of feel on unstable ground. That's how I feel, unstable ground. And I don't know how far he would have admitted this himself if I'm challenging him. I've never had the opportunity to do that. But I just feel there is a big kind of superstructure there which is very grand, but maybe it's not so real. With Teilhard, I feel much more grounded because of his very, very painstaking paleontological research. And you have all the scientific work published in numerous scientific articles with the drawings and with the evidence and with the conclusions that other scientists would agree with or would be able to work with. There is much more of a full picture there, and you have much more of a witness about his own process of becoming, which Panikkar tries to totally put into the background. And I have real problems with this. I don't know whether I should read out some of you can learn a lot from this book. I mean, he goes through various ideas there about the three chirological moments of consciousness: the ecumenic moment, the economic moment, the ecological interlude, the Catholic moment. But then you think, what is he actually talking about? It is sometimes not fully developed, and you get all these ideas thrown at you, and you think, well, he sometimes mentions Teilhard. He knew that people would compare it with Teilhard, but for Teilhard, he talks about, Panikkar says, an imperfect glimpse of a radiant spark, and then he uses German, ein Fünklein. What does he mean? Is he speaking about him, about Teilhard? You never know where you exactly are. You can't really get something firm and say, this is what he says.
Reminds me of Heidegger.
Yeah, really? Yeah.
It's hard to figure out what he's saying.
Yeah, it's
He has a lot to hide.
He has got a lot to hide. That's right. And you don't know how much. You don't know how much Panikkar has to hide. He finishes Cosmic Theology Experience, spirituality. He talks about anima mundi, the soul of the world, vita hominis, life of man, spiritus Dei, the spirit of God, the centrality of the cosmos, of the earth. The earth has a soul, is a living organism. Life is general, but also universal. You get all these kind of wide-ranging statements. Then he says there's need for new cosmology, but you really don't feel you can get hold of something solid. Where is it? I find I'm all the time on a moving ground. That's basically my problem. Now it's interesting what Stuart Cousins writes about this. Stuart Cousins wrote quite an interesting article about Teilhard global spirituality, but also about Panikkar. And I saw in a lecture that Ilya Delio gave recently, and it's on YouTube, we can look it up, and she quotes Stuart Cousins talking about both Teilhard de Chardin and Panikkar as mutational man. Mutational man. Now what does that mean? Mutation. And he applies it to Teilhard and Panikkar. because he says they live between two periods, i.e., from the actual age we are now moving into a new global consciousness, and that somehow Teilhard is a kind of bridge person, an evolutionary thinker, involved, well, she interprets him in Bergsonian terms, but I think that's a mistake, But she feels that they're both at the cusp of the change, really, the full change from the axial to a post-actual new kind of global consciousness, which is an interesting idea. Because, so,
Who's the she?
Ilia Deliot is a Franciscan nun who's professor. She's a scientist who went into philosophy theology. She's a fellow at Georgetown University, and she's written on evolution and now they write on the unfinished universe and what kind of tasks we have, all these kind of, not such new ideas, but just a different way of expressing what other people have said in a somewhat different form. So there is a lot going on. I mean, I have so many quotations and things, and I think this is just almost too much, because
Maybe we could open it up now.
yeah,
Because
one could go on, and in a way, I'm only saying the same thing again in a slightly different way. You see what I mean? Oh, of course, it's 20 to 6. My goodness, I've been going on for a long time.
Any insights, comments, questions? Richard?
First, I want to just thank you for bringing such life to Teilhard. I very much so resonate with the importance of his work, and I'm so delighted to see it come to life through your own vision and your own fire. And when I read your beautiful introduction to Teilhard,
I can not tell you, but I can give you a poster about Teilhard's, the biography of his life and vision, Spirit of Fire. It's 20 years old, 1996.
Yeah, it's one of our favorites.
Yeah, but this is now coming out in a new edition, updated, in a
fantastic.
chapter on legacy. So I pass this around. Take one, please. It's coming out in August. It's coming out. Sorry, just as
I'm
a
looking forward to it. Yeah,
interjection, because I really feel, well, Teilhard has a lot to give, but he was an extraordinarily humble man. I don't know whether you know this piece, which I would read out to you if you don't know it, by Jean Houston about Teilhard. Have you ever heard this story? If I can find it.
Heard tell the story. But
You
her
have-
meeting him in the park?
No, this is, she describes, she gave this talk at the London Body, Mind and Spirit Festival. And this is the expo thing I go to. You can have a look at this. This is this is all in Italian actually, but you can see what they're doing. Teilhard, planetary mind and our spiritual evolution. This is the conference that the Spaniards and the Italians have dreamt up. And that's what it is. Now wait a minute if I can find this story. I'm sure I've got it somewhere. Anyway, any questions?
Richard,
Oh yeah, I still want to maybe have a minute to go.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, so I wanted to offer some reflections to this baffling scenario that Teilhard was in the trenches and writing so poetically and beautifully
Yeah.
an affirmation of life.
Yes.
And I thought maybe those two events are not as baffling as we initially think. Maybe in the confrontation of death so visible and palpable in front of him,
Yeah.
he had no choice but to come to a cosmic affirmation of life. And that is that in the presentation of individual death in front of you,
Yeah.
the only vision, if you want to keep your faith, is an affirmation of these individual deaths being in service of a larger life that
That's
is
a
in the
very
background.
That's a very interesting interpretation. I like it. I've not thought of that, but I think I would think there's probably some truth in this. Yes.
Yeah, and it puts new meaning to this one line in the introduction to the phenomenon of man when he says, to see or to perish.
Okay.
So
okay.
the perishing is what's happening right in front of him, and the
Yeah.
seeing is the vision that goes to the cosmic life in the
Goes
background.
beyond, goes
Yes.
beyond. That's a very good point. Yes, I think that's a very good point. It's the affirmation of life in a context which is so governed by death, but where still there is the hope of going beyond this death.
That's right. I watched a documentary on like mountain climbers. And,
Okay.
Yeah, and in their struggle to survive, and
Yeah.
the reason why they are so attracted to climbing K2 with immense challenges, with a death rate of 25% of everyone that tries. But when you see their eyes as they're speaking about it, you see this affirmation of life. You see this spark
Gosh,
within
that's-
them that
that's
is
amazing.
extraordinary. And so I cannot help but feel that Teilhard might have had some experience in that vein.
Well, that's very interesting. That is very good. Very
Yeah,
good.
sure,
Very
thanks,
good.
Richard. Sean and Steph.
First, quick question about Cosmo Theandric. Theandric.
Yeah.
I thought andric is from ander, which is specifically the male gender. So I'm curious why it's andric and not anthropic. Because anthropos is the human, whereas ander, heander, toanthropos is human. Ander, if I remember my classical Greek correctly, is the male gender. So I'm curious about that.
Like androgynous,
Yeah.
androgynous. I somehow thought it was from a different word, but you make me doubt now. I thought there was the word aner, but I may be wrong, that meant a human being in a universal sense, and I thought it was from that, but I may be totally wrong there, I may be totally up the wrong tree, so I will have to check.
I'll have to check it,
yeah.
Is that just a question?
Rick?
I do know about that particular issue. It's aner, andros. Aner is the nominative.
Ander.
Aner with
Aner.
aner is the nominative, and then
Oh, right,
andros
aner, right.
and andres is.
The
the
aner
plural.
is the human in general.
Actually, Sean is correct. It's
It's
it
male.
has a
Sorry,
tendency.
ander.
Andros and aner
Aner.
are both the same word in different declensions.
Yeah.
And they both have the meaning of the male human being, typically.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so, I actually corresponded with my good friend Joseph Prabhu, who says, gives you greetings, he remembers
Oh,
you
thank
from
you.
many
Thank you.
decades.
Yes.
And because I said, why wouldn't he choose? I mean, obviously Raimundo knew Greek very well. Why
Yeah.
would he choose the masculine male rather than the more potentially generic? And it's because it comes from the Christian theological discussion of Christ as being both man and God.
I see.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
because in that context it was theandric,
Yeah.
he's picking up the theandric discussion. It's more almost like of an insider Christian thing.
I see.
Yes.
But I'm surprised that he wouldn't have refined it to cosmotheanthropic.
Yeah.
It goes, you have given me an extra point for my argument, because it goes absolutely with Panikkar. He has got in Cosmotheandric and in other books, he makes a big thing, because women scholars have really criticized him. And he says, he will just have one sentence. Everything he writes is inclusive, so he can go on saying men regardless. He thinks it's not an exclusive language, but it's jolly well damn exclusive.
Exactly.
And this is his pride. It's his pride. And I've had my arguments with Panikkar. So I feel really quite strongly about this, and I think I want to write a critique of this, because it's just too cheap and too simple to get away, to think you can get away with just a footnote saying, well, all my language is inclusive, and it's actually exclusive.
Right.
And the theandric is part of this.
That's right.
And Teilhard talks about the cosmic, human, and divine, and he says the human, l'humain, the human, not the male or the female, you see?
Right.
I mean, he has used theandrism, and you're absolutely right, it comes from Theos and Andros, is a Christian incarnation, the incarnation in Christ as a human being who is male.
Exactly.
So this is a very interesting debate for me, and I think there is some catching up to do.
Steph, last comment. You have 1 minute left.
Oh my goodness, oh my
Well,
goodness.
my question was about the human evolution and what do you think, what are the capacities or the affirmations or how does the human who is supposed to be the future in order to present these capacities to become creative?
Yeah, I mean, you are asking this, how can a human individual overcome that?
No, like as the phenomenon of how does a human would look in the future if we go?
Well, I would say, I mean, I'm not an expert in these matters, but I would say with the development of consciousness, and reflect the increase of the potential of the power of self-reflective consciousness in an individual sense, but not exclusively in an individual sense, more in terms of the human species as a whole, right? With not only the advance of education and of more education and more conceptualization, but also more realization in a more existential sense. There's in all this, what is now going on, these brain studies and neuroscience in terms of how synapses in the brain, I mean, I'm not a specialist, but what I hear and read, I mean, there's in the whole of new emergence of aspects we have not known about before or have not seen as possible before. I would think that there is an enormous potential, at least. Teilhard talks, even in the last page, if I could, I think I probably left it home, 3 or 4 pages, 3 days before he dies, he speaks about the ultra-evolution that, with all the extraordinary developments in science. He says that 3 days before his death, before he has a massive heart attack. We will gather more fuel, if you like, for the ultra-evolution of humanity. He sees a potential which we are too unimaginative to see or unhopeful to see. You see, so I could think, I mean, this is a potential that could develop in a potentially very good way, but it could also have the ambiguous outcome that it could be potentially very destructive. See, what is ultra-evolution? How can we develop our potential of consciousness? And what does it mean? What kind of energies would it produce? What kind of possibility would it produce? You see, what I like very much in Teilhard, what I've written on quite extensively, is he talks right from the beginning, right from the First World War, he talks about le goût, the taste, the zest for life. And our life is really for him a very positive concept and a movement which, he keeps saying to his friends, he says this in letters, he says this in articles, the dynamism, the thrust of life. Follow life, trust life, life is never mistaken. Life will carry us. So he has this sense of, life is almost like your guardian angel or God or whatever. But he talks about the zest of life, and I've made lists, how he categorizes zest of life. And then he has this marvelous short essay which is called The Names of Matter. And also in the Hymn of Matter, you can work out all the categories, what he associates with this, and you see the immense kind of flowering and the power. And, you can just see this burge and this blossoming out, like the biosphere, you get the growth of the noosphere. What's going to come next? The ontosphere or the Christosphere or the spirit sphere. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And it's a dynamic which you can hardly visualize or bear. It is so dynamic and so alive. So he feels that at the moment we are stuck in what we call now society of consumption and materialism. He uses different words for it, but he has absolutely marvelous pages where he says, what are we doing with all this overproduction, from books to babies to automobiles to, will we be suffocated by the excessive weight of the things we produce that we can't handle, right? And he says, well, we have all these engineers constantly calculating whether it's about finances or iron resources, where the material resources for the energy supply, whether it's oil or uranium or whatever. He says, where are the engineers of the spirit, the technicians who can calculate where are the spiritual energy resources? Where the resources for our inner life, for our mind, for our consciousness, for our motivation of action, and for our will to imagine and conceive and act to find the right road into the future. See, that's how he thinks, because for him, right from the beginning, it is, he says, the primacy of the future and the primacy of the spirit, not in a dualistic way, separate from matter, but how the spirit is born and rises out of matter, and with matter and transforms matter. I think it's a very powerful message. And you see, he sees an evolutionary role for religions in terms of providing spiritual energy resources. You want to call it the sources of wisdom, or the sources for animating the zest of life, or the sources for helping us in bearing our suffering and transforming it. You see, he speaks even about the energies you can draw out of suffering. He has got an extraordinary, hopeful approach, and I find it very life-giving, really very life-giving. So, he talks about being a pilgrim of the future. In 1923, when he comes from his long expedition in the Odyssey, I'm a pilgrim of the future who returns from a journey entirely made into the past, looking for human origin. I'm a pilgrim of the future. And then he says, where is the homo progressivus? Where is the progressive human being that will build up and work towards the future? Where is the artisan of the earth? That's also in one of his late writings, the artisan of the earth as a whole. I mean, it's very powerful stuff.
I think Dr. King has found the secret of the zest for life. Ursula, thank you.
It's true. I mean, it has given me many an encouragement. I can tell you, I had a student, I used to ask the students when we did seminars what they got out of discussing Theology. We used to study the hymn of the universe, and I had an art student who wrote, she said, I had such a depression last year, and all the medicine that the doctors gave me have not helped me half as much as this study of Theology. It is a pretty powerful testimony.